applying your sample, I mean, I'd be really interested for you to explain, is this like testing? Is this people testing, or how do you explain the, starting small and growing? Or is this just
Well,
the
a
nature
lot
of
of
crime
time,
broadly?
well, a lot of times the men felt they were justified in raping, that they preferred raping rather than consent. So the problem was the victim wasn't consenting, but they weren't believing the victim. And it was so easy for them to talk their way out of it. Well, she really did consent, or you got the wrong person. Those are really the only two defenses you can come up with in rape. So from that standpoint, they're getting away with it is what was the high. They got high on that. And because that wasn't enough, they had to do more and more. And that's where the escalation feature comes in. So I don't know whether that has anything to do with your population, whether they just wanted, I wanted to ask a question on profiling. I don't know whether you would find this, was there a way that in a company, they knew something was wrong, money was disappearing or whatever, and they would have to profile or figure out who was doing it? Did you have that kind of a situation?
So much of my research now, it's not in my book, but most of the work I do now is I'm a quant by training. So I spend a lot of my time now using large data sets and collaborating with companies to take, if we take HR data, we take violations data, we'll take survey data, try to find where hotspots are within the organization that there are going to be violations. And there are a number of predictable, patterns. I mean, kind of two is, everyone talks about tone from the top, but it turns out it's kind of tone from the middle. If your manager does X, you see that start popping up in the people who work for him or her. The most interesting though is, I'll say, it's unsubstantiated HR violations predict future legal violations. And so what we find is that if people raise a concern their manager, so oftentimes it's someone saying my manager is harassing me because of XYZ, and the firm looks into it, the bar for actual legal harassment is actually very, very high. So you can actually do some pretty egregious things as a manager and still not be engaging in harassment that would actually create disciplinary action. So the person doesn't see the firm do anything about it. And so they, I think, quite rightfully infer that the firm doesn't respect my views. And so what happens down the road, you don't respect the firm as much. And then we see that manifest as, starts out small things, maybe showing up a little bit late for work. And then it turns into things like, embezzlement, actual like legal violations that unfortunately both undermine the individual and the company simultaneously. So we can start to see some of these patterns, but it's not the richness.
Right.
I'll say it's much more predictable, what I call in my case, since it's relatable, it's kind of predictable human nature. If someone doesn't respect you, you don't respect them back. And that map can take an otherwise pretty normal individual and actually turn them into someone that unfortunately will do things that have some pretty unfortunate consequences.
Sure.
Very different.
Did you probably you wouldn't have had this kind of situation where they would be able to deny and say they never did it, because you really would have the evidence, you would have the financial evidence. But we had situations where even after conviction, they would say they didn't do it. Look at John Gacy was a prime example of that. He absolutely denied that he did this. He admitted to one, but denied the other 32 up until the time he was executed. So do you ever had any of your subjects that once they were arrested or whatever, that they would deny?
Well, I mean, almost most people, if they're going to go to trial, they're not guilty, and you hire very good defense counsel who try to separate, because, there isn't, again, you can kind of construct things. So right now, for example, there's the Theranos. I'm sure many people that watch this will hear Elizabeth Holmes and the big case of the pharma. And I mean, it's really interesting. On one hand, if you've read, the book and seen some, many people's like, this is pretty black and white. I mean, clearly there wasn't the product that worked, and so it's fraud. However, if you actually look at the case, it's much more subtle than that, because in Silicon Valley, it's very common that you tout your innovations. You're building there and you're being very optimistic. That's puffery, and puffery is what we all look at when we look at an advertisement. When we go to buy a used car and the person says that's the best price I can give you, and it turns out it's not truly the best price. We don't go to the local police or go to like the FBI and say that car salesman defrauded me because they said that's the best price, and it wasn't literally the best price. That's puffery.
Puffery.
And so what you find is a lot of very clever, executives, and this is where it becomes borderline. What's actually the distinction between puffery and fraud?
Right.
Fraud will you can go to prison for. Puffery is something we accept or at least tolerate, and that division isn't black and white. And so a lot of people would start, and as you would probe further, they might say there was something they would do a little bit differently, but it's not criminal. This is something that a speeding ticket, it's a civil fine, would have resolved, which, is a way of reinterpreting one's actions as well. Did you find, as I always think, the question that I always get is, well, a lot of your work, you see, you're getting just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more fraud out there than what we're detecting, and certainly a lot more than we see hitting the headlines. And that's always the challenge, is like, what is the amount of fraud that actually exists? And as academics, we spend a lot of time trying to come up with clever ways of estimating that. Do you feel like there are other people, or are there other people, or how many other people are out there that kind of should be, I'll say, that should be in here, but are just not, that get away with it?
Well, we know that there are, because at least with the crime of murder, you have a dead body. Mm-hmm. So if you don't solve that case, you still got an unsolved case. And the best statistics say it's only a little more than half get solved. So there's a lot of what we call cold cases out there where they haven't been able to find who did it. So then the question becomes, could that person have been a serial killer? Could that person be responsible for other kinds of crimes? And sure enough, if they've already killed, and especially if it's a sexual killing, there should be a way to find out that there were others, because that's one of the things that we did determine with serial killing when it was sexual. So you have a harder problem, because you have to, that's why I said, how do you know when you have a problem? When does a company know when they have a problem? Unless they have some very obvious financial losses or something that aren't making any sense. I remember hearing about a case where the person was just taking off 1 cent off of everybody's balance sheet. Now, 1 cent, a lot of people would never think much of it, but he had done so much of it. He really amassed quite a bit of money by that. So that wouldn't be picked up, or I forget how it was picked up, but there's a good case where something could have gone on for quite a while and nobody picked it up until, I guess it was the bank that picked it up. So you have a harder problem, I think, in some ways.
Different, I will say, just different. The rounding, I think you're referring to some of the early programs like rounding. So when you have a transaction that was like 0.3 cents, so it's not even a cent. And so some computer programmer thought they were clever and take the biggest less than a penny and just take that and put that in their bucket. This was in the movie Office Space.
Maybe that was it was somewhere.
And, anyway. On one hand, you're like, well, of course, none of us would miss that, and that could add up to a lot very, very quickly. Sure. But that's fraud. That's embezzlement. You're stealing someone's money. That's not yours.
No. But in murder, we know when we have a missing person or a body. Not always a missing person. A lot of times there are a lot of missing persons that families don't know if they have been murdered. So we have that problem too. And we have what's called unidentified dead. So we have, in the crime world, we have all of these little categories where when you start looking at them across 50 states, it makes quite a difference.
And so what would you do? So I'm going to give because one thing that I find fascinating, and even by the title of your book, is you look at the episodes that people have had early in their life that seem to, I don't know if predict is the right, but have a high proclivity for some. So what would you, I'm getting into, I think it's the time I was thinking, I think it's a Tom Cruise movie where, it's the Minority Report. That's suppose we could have perfect prediction, or like as a perfect insight. Like what do we do? I'll say it can lead to some very extraordinary, if someone is like, is hitting all the buttons, so to speak, of having, what do we do about it?
Well, that's I was just talking about the Glatman case. Now it's an old case, but he was what was called the Lonely Hearts guy. And he would get his victims by putting an ad saying, I'm looking for a model. I need to put it into a magazine. Of course, women would call in and so forth. Well, when you look at and he murdered, and he would get them in, he would photograph them in very different phases, and he would use all these horrible photos. But when you looked at his history, his childhood history, his mother knew that something was wrong with her boy, that he was doing odd things, if you will, takes him to a therapist, and the therapist says he's going to grow out of it. He's just a 13-year-old kid. He's going to get out of that. So we do have situations where the parent, and it's always the mother knows when something's not right. And she didn't get any help with it. And so it just got worse and worse. And he was bright, and so he was able to go on and get a job and so forth. But he had this photography business where he was getting victims and killing them. So what do you do in those situations? Well, what we say is you have to educate people that they have to find out what's going on in the child's mind. I mean, take that awful case that we have right now out in
school shooting.
Yeah. And he tells them, and at least what the newspaper reports, he says, I can't stop the thoughts. Help me. He even writes that down. His thoughts are have started early and should have been paid attention to, and nobody did. They don't try to find out what is prompting the thoughts.
Is it I want to say correctable, maybe that's the right way, or a way, I mean, what's the solutions? I mean, in this case, and I realize
the solution. Yeah, well, the solution is to get the person, the child, to talk about the thoughts, and then you have to neutralize them. Now, in that case, it probably medication would certainly take care of it. That's one option, and get him into therapy so that you can keep him under surveillance, so he doesn't, and certainly not give him anything that he can.
Oh, well, of course.
Gosh, of course. Yeah. I mean, no child should have that. But at any rate, it's getting into the mind, getting into the cognitive structure. That stuff starts early. And where, say, 10 kids could have the same experience, one might have it that really moved him into this very lethal type of thinking and wanting to hurt one. And it's all the wanting to hurt. I mean, your point about your population not wanting to hurt, very different in the killer population.
Yeah, I mean, because it actually strikes me that if we had like the resource or something where we could intervene more effectively,
yes.
Because I mean, there's something both extraordinary reading, your career and your work here, but there's also something that, I mean, you see the amount of effort and resources to respond, and well, it's also preventative. But if we could figure out how to intercede earlier, I mean, it's the same. I think this is something similar with what we spend a lot of resources. I mean, we have a huge part of like a fraud section in the Department of Justice. What we would prefer is just the fraud didn't occur in the first place. I mean, we want to hold those accountable. We want them to stop doing it further, of course, but like, as a society, we're much better, I would say, getting kind of amped up and putting those resources to figure out what to do next rather than to prevent. And I don't know if there's any way, and that's, I think, similar in some ways.
Well, it is similar. And in all of the cases that we in the general public have been able to kind of follow, like the Gabby Polito case was another good example, horrible example, but good in terms of how it could have been prevented. Because any of us that work with violence against women, especially, could have said those red flags, you've got to get in there and do something and not just let them be together because something bad is going to happen. So the more it gets back to education, not only education, but why not call in the experts? I mean, in your field, I would hope that companies are calling you ahead of time to say, should we be concerned because X, Y, and Z, we're observing X, Y, and Z. Same in my field is I hope that they would call us when they got a kid that's really showing problems.
Yeah, I think what we ideally want, and I mean, I will say in the world of like white collar and like I'll say corporate, it's a cost center. It bogs people down. It's the training to prevent things. It's putting surveillance and monitoring. You generally minimize it until you can't anymore in so many instances, and then it's only when it starts to hit the headlines or attract government that now all of a sudden you're actually doing what what you ideally would have liked to have done earlier, but it's in that way a little bit still maybe responsive.
Well, take the example you gave, because I have followed it a little bit. It's the Elizabeth, I forget her last
Elizabeth
name.
Holmes.
Holmes, yeah. Is there, and could that have been picked up earlier? Was there any type in that type of case? Of course, that's a where a
female. It's actually very. I'll say it's one thing. It's pretty similar between our books. I use he throughout my books because it's even white collar. If we go to fraud, it's primarily men, and even
Yes.
when we take into account some of the differences in just boardroom representation, it's still disproportionately men. But yeah, Elizabeth Holmes is kind of a unique in being,
yeah.
both female and like a young kind of entrepreneur. And there's also not as many entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
I mean, in her case, it would be, you see just the extraordinary people she was surrounded by. I suspect very different than,
Sure.
where you're talking about people they come up from abusive backgrounds and abusive homes, certainly didn't come from privileged upbringing. I mean, most of the people in my book, I mean, almost all of them come from extraordinarily privileged, went to the best
Yes,
schools,
that's right.
lived a life. I think anyone would be,
Sure.
very comfortable, to say the least. And it's under those circumstances that they then engage in the misconduct that leads the retirement, rather than being in kind of Fiji. And in some instances, because of the length of their sentence, I think probably not so dissimilar prisons than some of the people, if you have a 25, 30-year sentence. I don't know where the break is between minimum and some of the higher levels, but
yeah.
very uncomfortable.
We didn't have that. Of course, ours primarily kills strangers. When you change populations and get into people that kill known or intimates, that's a whole different matter. We had one female on female killer. We had the Proddy case in the book, which was unusual. These were two teenagers, and primarily the motive was jealousy, but the one killed the other. Never was clear if it was intentional. Well, it wasn't. It was intentional to hurt her, but not necessarily to kill her, is what I think the final decision was.
What was your, in terms of taking information? It's the same thing I dealt with, and people were very skeptical, and this is one of the things I battled throughout the whole project of, what do you believe, don't believe? How did you work with this over time?
Well, we worked with it because we had records, and we always cross-referenced what the offender was telling us with what was in the record. And because the agents had talked with so many, that they became pretty, like you certainly talked with a lot of your sample, that you can pretty well then tell when you really think something's being embellished or when it's something that's really true. We always felt, and I think it's true, that they would never tell you anything more than what they thought that you could find out. In other words, they'd never confess, to any more crimes. Of course, they were told in the beginning that if they confessed to any other crimes, they would have to report it. So I think that would work against what they were saying.
Yeah, it does seem, yeah, that wasn't too good, system, but it's understandable that you're probably not going to ignore that if they did admit it.
Yeah, but the other funny thing that I don't know if I put it in the book. I think we put it in the book is the agents had to sign a paper that if they were taken prisoner or hostage inside of the prison, which is where they had to go to interview, that they wouldn't negotiate.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, interesting.
No, the FBI was not going to negotiate.
So just to be very clear on
that, right? But anyway, so back when they did the interviews, you can imagine that was something. Well, they got into trouble on one Bob Ressler when he went to push the button to get out of he was in with Ed Kemper. It was a big guy. I don't know if you saw any of the pictures. This was really big, like 6'8" something. And Bob's only 6'1". And he went to push the buzzer that he was through, and they were supposed to come and unlock the door, and nobody came. Came. And he was really starting to sweat. And Kemper is saying, I could just with one hand grab you by the neck. And Bob said, I don't think he would do that. And he was really sweating. And finally, the guy, it was at the change of shift is why
Wow. That's
after that, they always had two that went. They never let one agent go alone.
That's I mean, it's something with enough time and with some hindsight, you can kind of, yes, mildly laugh now, but I can only imagine.
Oh, can you imagine?
Terror.
Yeah. That was Ed Kemper.
So, I mean, obviously they made a TV series on this, and I will say it's one of the few times you see so Mindhunter, like what about, I'm curious, like your character?
Oh yeah, I'm always asked about that.
Yeah, what's because actually your character, I believe, was a white collar crime expert. It's the one thing I do remember at the beginning, and I was like, oh my gosh, is there someone I know that's an academic?
Wow.
So it's so fascinating to meet now.
Well, what was fascinating is everything they had about the cases was accurate. They did a great job with that because, of course, they had all the interviews and so forth, but they had the background so bad. I mean, they were like 180. But when the two in the Netflix, when they go to Boston, they come to Boston, which is true, and they start talking. Dr. Carr, Wendy Carr, is talking about her research on white collar criminals. Did you know that?
Yes, I know. I was.
And she said, yeah, and so they said, oh, well, what are you finding in yours? And that's why I thought when I heard we were going to be on the same show tonight, I thought, I wonder if that was any coincidence that and she says, oh, I'm sure they're just like anyone else, they got a home and this and goldfish. I laugh at the goldfish. But that was, that's the way that it starts out, that when they introduce my character. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like they may have, we'll all just kind of blended us together to create your Netflix version of you with Boston white collar and then going into what you do.
Yeah. And it is true that when she says, well, you'll have to, you have to organize your material better. You have to have some methodology, et cetera, et cetera. And she said, and then you have to publish. And they jump up with publish, and she said, yes, you have to publish outside of your own field of law enforcement. And she said, and they say a book or something. And then she says, well, no, some journals, some scientific journals would be best, but then a book, she said. So that's what gets them all excited, the idea that they're going to have a book.
I mean, one of the things that I especially liked and admired and about your book is it actually, there's another parallel story that I felt particularly actually relatable to, which is, I mean, your work was not always well accepted, actually by multiple audiences, but you kind of forged ahead and really pushed in so many unconventional ways. And I'm just curious if you could reflect a little bit more. I mean, it was just fascinating, and I just admired so much, because I'll say I think I probably had it easy being a scholar doing the work last. I mean, you're doing this work at a time in which I can only imagine the resistance you got in so many different dimensions. And
Absolutely.
Not to mention, obviously, I have the advantage. I mean, being a female scholar doing this kind of work in an area, you had even additional layers.
People would always say, how did you ever get into it? Which I knew translated to mean, how could you be working in this area? So, I mean, it is interesting, the backstories that are there. But did you ever get much pushback for your work?
Yeah, it didn't seem rigor. I will say that part, like the rigor. I mean, in the world I operate, we like regressions and we like big data sets, and the idea of what could you learn by spending time with people, talking with people, that we couldn't get from just looking at the data that's currently, available. And, I think there are some observations, like in my case, actually probably something, a lack of remorse. There was a lack of remorse. They missed their, daughter's graduation, their son's birthday, some of the creature comforts, but there wasn't remorse for their actual victims in this instance, because they didn't see them trying to hurt people in this instance, so they didn't think there's anything to be remorseful about that regard, which is probably a very different way of a lack of remorse from but I'll say it's that kind of observation that you could only get from talking, and it actually goes to explaining why otherwise, in my case, like reasonable strategic individuals could actually do these extraordinary things, because if you don't have that kind of sensor blinking and going off, you can keep proceeding kind of down that path without feeling that you have to stop.
Now, did your sample stay in the company, or would they move from company to company and do the same thing?
So mine, they stayed in the company, generally
Okay,
stay in the
yeah.
company. But I will say this is since I've worked on this, and I will say the book is really about what I would think of as financial crimes. So, fraud, bribery. If we actually go to a different set of misconduct, like what I call the things in the news now with Me Too, assault, harassment, that's actually where we'd find people, actually,
Yeah.
because companies are so worried about defamation, and lawsuits, that oftentimes what they have is someone that does something really horrendous to, some people they work with. They don't want to expose the company to litigation. They don't want to be in the news. So you quietly let that person resign. They go to another firm. They say they moved for family reasons or some personal reasons. They
Sure.
can call for a reference. They say that person quit. And you see actually these really awful managers going from company to company and never being kind of dinged. And so
Yeah,
those are actually some of the work I'm doing now, because actually those are the people that I'm
sure,
actually most concerned about their systematic, adverse effect that they could have.
sure.
Okay.
Well, in a way, we look at that too, in terms of how often had the person moved? Did he have any good connections, any social good connections in this upbringing? Of course, as you've already pointed out, we look much more at the social indicators. Many of these men had the absent father. It wasn't that the parents, well, many of them parents separated and divorced, but they usually did not stay in touch with the father. So that absent father, it always bothered me initially before I started the work with how they would always talk about the bad mother. It was always the mother's fault. If there's anything wrong with the child, is that the mother was cold or uncaring or something like that. And that's true. We had some of that, but I was more impressed that the father was never around. So there was no really strong male authority that could kind of keep the kid in line to if he had some transgressions. So
Okay.
did you get into any backgrounds of your they were so successful, I guess, that there weren't a lot of social indicators.
All right, I'm gonna let you answer this question, but once you're done, we
Oh.
have a couple of questions, and I want to make sure we get them all in before we go. So you can go ahead with
Super.
that. I guess that's our first question.
Well, I'll do this one. So the answer is sure, no. Anything people had great upbringings, like great parents, supportive parents. I mean, on paper, it's something that I think we would all kind of hope, our kids or others could have those kinds of amazing upbringings. Which that's what makes it all that much more tragic that you end up, later in your career to your son or daughter's in prison rather than, thriving as you tried.
Are we supposed to read a question from?
No,
Lauren?
no, I have a couple of questions.
Oh, okay.
So we have a couple of audience questions. So we're going to start with you, Eugene. For your book, Why They Do It, you focus on white collar crime. For those who may not know, can you tell us or give us a short overview? What exactly is white collar crime, and what are the most common examples of a white collar crime?
Yeah, so white collar crime, there's a couple different ways of looking at it, but I like to think of it as it's in most instances privileged individuals or people that are working with inside organizations that are engaged in certain kinds of deviance that generally have some type of financial relationship associated with it. So the most common we tend to think about are money laundering, bribery, financial fraud, embezzlement. It's the kind of thing that anyone can do if they work within their organization. And they're the kind that people oftentimes can do and still feel that they are still a respectable individual while engaged in something that's very much criminal and will lend, and you can end up in prison doing it.
Yeah, okay. Well, the conversation I think around these two different types of crime, even though it's under the same umbrella of true crime, something like a serial murderer and someone who is fraudulent at their company, they're received very differently. I feel like this is just a question I have for both of you. How do you feel about that when you're looking at like sort of the popularization of these figures, but how they're starkly treated differently, especially like one who goes to prison for multiple years and never sees the light of day, and there are a lot of people, some would say, who commit white collar crimes who get off pretty easy, or have the money to sort of navigate their trial slightly differently. What do you think of that?
Eugene, that's for you?
That's for
I think
both of you.
I can answer
Yeah.
one, but not, you want me to take it first?
yeah, please, or related,
Okay.
please.
Yeah, right now I'm embarking on another project. I really want to talk with many of the cases that have been what we call death penalty cases, and they have ended up on death row. And so I'm interested in how they look at things compared to those that just get life. So there's a discrepancy, and it's incredible if on someone that got life killed like the whole family kind of thing, and they got life, whereas one of my cases killed one person, dismembered her, and that's what really got him, and ends up on death row. So there is a real discrepancy in how juries or judges would determine whether somebody is going to get just life with no parole versus if they're going to be on death row. So that's in my population, but Eugene, I think you probably have different experience with your sample.
Yeah, I mean, people are forgiving, I will say, in a lot of instances, or at least their immediate circle. If you have resources and money, you can you can come back. I mean, just a very good example, Michael Milken was one of the most well-known kind of people in the 1980s when it came to, white collar. It was one of the major cases. And, since then, he's now, is a deeply well-respected individual when it comes to the healthcare, runs one of the most important and significant conferences. And so you can dramatically change and kind of come back. Companies where if we see the headline grabbing attention, companies generally have something called a deferred prosecution agreement, which is we don't want to necessarily put a company in prison because they can't go to prison, but criminally penalize them. And so kind of unlike, I will say, if you murder someone, you don't get to go in front of a judge and say, I won't do this again. I really have changed my ways. And we let people go. Actually, kind of ironically, when it comes to companies, that's a little bit, in I'll say slightly caricatured way, what happens is that we allow organizations to actually engage in egregious conduct and for a variety of reasons. For example, a pharmaceutical company. The government doesn't want to shut down a pharmaceutical company. There'd be a lot of, and so since you don't want to shut them down, but they did something really awful, you put them in kind of what I call it, the penalty box, but they can come back from that. And so it's a much murkier kind of setting. You don't want to penalize people too much, but you feel like you need to penalize them some. And that's the world of white collar, which is what really frustrates people. Not saying we should have the death penalty or we go with that, but we don't even have life. Like we don't have life. We have like a 3 or 5 year sentence. It's kind of what as harsh as it gets, kind of in white collar.
Oh, it's so interesting. So here's another question, and you kind of touched on this a little earlier, but how did you get into your career? What got you started? And Aaron, you can take this first, and Eugene, once Anna's done, I'd love to hear about how you got started.
Oh, well, I got started basically as a nurse, a psychiatric nurse. In nursing, you specialize at the graduate level. So that's where my psychiatric nursing came. And my research, it really was the research when I was at Boston College that a sociologist, Linda Holmstrom, knew that rape was going to be a big issue for women, and she liked to study women's issues. So we embarked on a 1-year study of rape victims coming into Boston City Hospital and had some of the very first publications in the field. One of the major papers was Rape Trauma Syndrome, where we actually identified a whole pattern of response that victims had after being raped. That article caught the attention of the FBI. And similarly, at the same time, they were getting pressure from the women's movement to do something about rape investigation. They had no one trained at the academy to teach the new agents. And so another officer out in LAPD was also a nurse, had read my article in the American Journal of Nursing, and so called Roy Hazelwood at the FBI and said, there's someone out in the East Coast that's studying rape. Why don't you give her a call? And that's how it started. So I ended up going down there to just train in rape investigation, later it expanded into the serial killer study. So that's kind of my story. Eugene?
So maybe it's one area where we'll probably overlap a little bit. So my work became very much not as an academic project, but personal curiosity. I was actually back finishing up my doctoral dissertation, and I was up at 3 a.m, as all the grad students should be, running regressions and waiting for that output. And I was flipping through the TV channels, and I came across a show on MSNBC called Lockup, where they're actually interviewing people that engage in things like murder, and they're describing their backgrounds, and generally it's kind of drugs and gangs and various. And I was thinking of the cases that were in the news, like Enron and WorldCom, and I said, if I had 30 minutes with one of these executives, like what would they say? And so I just, personal curiosity is like a grad student, just started writing some of them letters, and just started listening to what they had to share. So it's actually, maybe this is where all crime we all start with that level of the stuff that is terrifying and scary, and then we branched.
Very good.
This is also another question for both of you. I have a couple of those. Is there any project that you're working on, and you kind of talked about this a little as well, any projects that you're working on, books in your future, things that we can look forward to?
I can start. I am with my co-author, Stephen Constantine, on our second book. And the second book is going to be more of my cases, especially not necessarily with the FBI, but cases that I started doing when I was called on my own. So that will be expanded there. But the project I also am hoping will evolve is, I always want to see if with all these serial killers, we can reduce they can catch them faster. I think the whole idea of cold cases is really tough. When you get talking with law enforcement, they just have these cases that they can't solve. So I want to go back and interview the lifers and the ones on death row to say what could have helped to have them catch you sooner. So you would have had fewer victims, and you wouldn't necessarily be where you are now if you had fewer victims. And actually, it was Henry Wallace, who is in the current book that you have, who said, yes, the police made missteps with me. He said, I wish that they had followed up, and I wouldn't be in the trouble I'm in. He says, I knew it was going to be a death penalty because I had too many victims.
Wow,
So
it's surprising that they're even willing to help. But
yeah, I was amazed. Yes. I was going to ask Eugene, although in his book he says they will talk, they want to talk. I don't know about this population of on death row, but we'll see.
I mean, I found, at least in is that certainly, especially when people are isolated. I mean, at the heart, I'm an economist, and I can talk technical, and I think a lot of people they miss their professional life in my instance. So I was someone they could talk about, what was going on in the markets or in macroeconomic news. And that itself was interesting if someone just to engage with on what I would say is a professional level. And that's how we developed a rapport. And my view is, no matter what people did, I treated them professionally and respectfully. And I think that's something they also just missed, being, stuck in a prison. And that, we've actually bought some goodwill associated with individuals over time. Treating people like an individual and with what I call just respect, it seems to go a long way. I think that's even something I saw in your book is, I mean, that's not, in any way letting people, they can do terrible things, but you can still treat people as individuals and with a certain degree of professional respect, talking. And that seems to be a kind of a unifying theme that seems to be really surprising to people. Certainly when, especially when they're in these situations like in prison, where that doesn't, that's not what they're used to anymore.
Right. That's such a good point. And certainly the ones that I see they like get 1 hour a day, they can come out of their cell. So you can imagine how isolated that is. But the other point you make is what I found with my population is that they were so despised by the society at what they had done, that to have anybody that would talk with them and want to be on this. And as I said to them, I'm not necessarily, yes, I am a defense witness, but I want to bring the best of science to the jury, and they can make the decision. I don't make the decision, but I think that they felt at least they'd have a chance. So treating them with professional respect is a great way of putting it. I agree.
Okay. Well, my final question, we have 1 more minute until 8. So my final question is for both of you as well. Is there one story when you're doing these interviews, doing these research, doing this insane research, meeting with people from various backgrounds, meeting with criminals, that stands out, that stuck with you, that made you say, wow, in a good way, in a bad way, in whatever way? What's something that stands out amongst all the work that you've done? We can start with Eugene.
Well, I guess for me, I'll probably, Bernie Madoff was the most unusual person, I've actually ever spent time with in my life. He's different than certainly anyone else in the book. He didn't have the ability to empathize with people in the same way. And so I describe a little bit in the book, a call that he made, which still I think back often on, when his second son passed away. He actually called me to read the obituary to him when he actually heard about it. And there's something, and I will say, I still, I'm an academic, I'm trying to understand, I'm trying to convey information, and there's something, pretty both extraordinary and I would say uncomfortable that someone is calling you to read something that's it's such like a deep personal level. So I oftentimes think back, his reaction, which, we spoke about, I read the obituary, and then about 20 seconds later, he wanted to go back and talk about Swiss interest rates. And I'll never forget, like, the ability just to flip and now talk. He was different. I don't think anyone else that I've encountered can compartmentalize in that way. And I think that's what made him a both unique, but also, very, in some ways, troubled individual, which I think he appreciated. Probably the closest person I speak with that had something different kind of compositionally to him, as compared to, still a long way from Anne, your group, but let me turn to you.
Well, in my group, I always was fascinated with how I would react to them when I had the interview, because I'd read all about the horrible things that they've done, looked at the crime scenes and so forth. And I'd have to say that Henry Wallace was one that was really, really important. And Bob Russell and I were both on defense on that case. And it was the only Black serial killer that we had. It was one also that knew all of his victims. And this was very different from the others that had strangers for victims, and they and anyway, Henry had a very poor background, but he was very well liked, and that came through. You'd like him. You really would like him. I remember Bob saying he really liked him when he first met him, and it's because he did have a social awareness, and he was on the on the football he was a cheerleader, and he was his favorite job was being a disc jockey at night. He had this very deep voice, and he was called the Midnight Rider, and people loved his his story. But anyway, and he really went wrong right after his marriage broke up. So you had this feeling of he had everything okay up to a certain point. People liked him, he was doing well, and then he started these crimes, and they were little crimes. He would steal some things, and then it got worse and worse. And but anyway, he was one, and I think it was because he had such an engaging personality, and felt great remorse for his victims. He got up at his trial, and he apologized to all the families and said that nothing that their daughters had done in any way influenced what he did, and he was wrong. And I think that they have, in some degree, could at least accept that. So that's my one.
Okay, well, those are both interesting. And honestly, as a true crime watcher myself, I find both types, white collar and more severe crimes, to be just fascinating. And I think I'm not alone when I say that. There are a lot of people out there who find it fascinating, macabre, a little bit somewhere in between. So those are the questions we had for tonight. Thank you again, both of you, for joining us despite some hiccups. For those watching, don't forget to check out Anne and Eugene's books, Why They Do It and A Killer by Design, the latter of which is on sale tomorrow from Hachette Books. Anne and Eugene, it was amazing to hear from you tonight. You guys had a great conversation. There's some good chemistry